the digital worlds and still communicating these ways in the story in a very tangible way and very visceral way, and still communicating the something that is supposed to be informational and educational, but still using and embracing VR in a way that, as I said, you're constructing new worlds and you're supposed to transform your audience and take them to places they couldn't normally go. And I would say that that's the biggest, I think, approach, is like telling stories that can't be told in any other way, like Eliza was saying, and just like a little creative freedom. But essentially still making sure that it's thinking of it as a journey or a different worlds and spaces that you experience as an audience member.
Yeah, I think approaching it as like a traditional filmmaker, it could be overwhelming to think, but the audience can look anywhere they want. And people often ask me, how do I direct a VR experience? And I think that's the wrong question. I think it's, what is the world that you're trying to imagine, and how are you going to immerse people in that experience? And I think then, you provide the audience with the tools to decide where they choose to experience. And there's so much you can do too through sound design, music, and through the types of elements you bring into the story. So I think when you're creating a world, it's really about asking that first question, which is why VR? Why does this need to exist here? And when I was creating the Orion Nebula, what was so exciting was that I got to, very scientifically and accurately, based off of Hubble imagery and NASA data, create what it would actually be like if you went there. And we worked with scientists to advise us and create that world. And the good news is that if we were wrong, no one will ever know. It's thousands of light years away. But it's exciting to be able to create a whole universe that you can explore and give that freedom to the viewer to journey throughout the images that you create.
So with that, and I was thinking about your especially Eliza, your scientific and space-themed experiences a little bit, and they're literally universal in their scale, obviously, or massive in their scale. And so much about expressing a narrative in VR is about creating the sense of intimacy, which you've done very successfully, like, despite that challenge of the massive scale. Like, what are the tools at your disposal as storytellers to evoke emotion, whether that's intimacy or fear or longing or whatever it might be? What are those tools at your disposal in the design of your experience? Paul, do you want to take a stab?
I say this at almost every panel and every talk I give, so I don't know, sorry if you've heard this before, but it's true, for me at least, for us. The very, very, very first thing we always ask ourselves with any project, and I think that's what really amplifies everything you just listed, whether it's intimacy or empathy or any emotion, really, anything you can do to emphasize the presence of the viewer in the experience. It's not an automatic thing that just putting on a VR headset or putting a VR camera down somewhere does not automatically create presence. The staging, the framing, the positioning, the context you give to either the actors or the real people that if it's a documentary, of what this camera is and what it represents, will change everything and will really, I think, make or break. At the very least, it will amplify all these emotions if it's done with care. So often an idea will live or die by whether or not we can figure out an interesting role for the viewer, and often that role is you're just yourself, especially in documentaries. Then it's just a question of, well, where are you and how or why and how everyone else is interacting with you. An example I like to give is the very, very first piece we made, Strangers, with Patrick Watson. We treated the camera as a friend, and we told Patrick, this camera is a friend of yours visiting you in your studio. We asked him where a friend would usually sit, at which distance, and which angle, and that's where we positioned the camera, and he acted and related to that camera with that direction as well. So it's very simple but I think you can kind of build on that, and that's been something that's been the foundation of almost everything else we've done.
And in your recent experience, Yasmin, with 0 Days, which is told almost entirely through abstract imagery, as you were saying, trying to embody the sense of computer code as a living organism. Same question, like what tools were at your disposal, or did you find it very liberating? In terms of evocation?
No, for me, it was very liberating.
As a programmer?
Yes, I'm a computer scientist by training, and I fell in love with Stuxnet. I shouldn't say this, but I did. And I found kind of creating this documentary, and it's an adaptation, I should mention, of a feature film. So it's a directed by Alex Gibney, participant media film, that is a talking heads documentary, very information-packed, and maybe a lot of people find that as a challenge of how do you take that and make it 20 minutes and very told from the perspective of the virus itself. But for me, it felt like, oh, I have all these new tools at my disposal, and we played around with a lot. I should mention, like at Scatter, we're hybrids of artists and technologists, and we believe like both art and technology have to keep driving each other. And so we used, I think, Unity, a timeline tool that Unity had created for the first time. We have our own tool called DepthKit, which we captured an NSA informant to make her anonymous. She's an amalgamate character that represents all these testimonies, and she helps drive the story. We use things like camera moves that are big no-nos, at least according to the VR rulebook. And it's like kind of what both Paul was referencing. How do you welcome someone into your world, and you can have the world make you feel a certain way, and you can have your camera moves, because you are the camera essentially in VR, make you feel nervous or tense, or so I felt like it was like completely liberating. It's almost like too many tools to play with, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Liza?
Sure. Well, space is terrifying. It's silent, and there's so much that's unknown, and that's what we found so exciting and beautiful about the idea of creating a VR experience about some of the most iconic images that the Hubble telescope has ever taken. And the heart of our piece is really about bringing in the human connection to the cosmos. And that's what I think is so exciting about virtual reality, is that you are transported there, and not only that, but you can really, you use the tools not just to show people the place, but to tell a story. And when we were first building the experience for Fistful of Stars, I actually had, it was about a woman floating in the stars, and there was this, human protagonist, a part of the story. And it just didn't work. There was something about it that just didn't feel real. And I discovered that, with VR, you can completely, through the absence of humans, you create an even deeper connection with humanity itself, through music, through voiceover and narration, and through the, using the language and the tools of film that we have traditionally learned. And so that was what I found so exciting about creating more of an intimate connection to ourselves. And the idea that drove our film was this scientific idea that the atoms in our bodies are forged inside of the furnaces of stars, and therefore it is true that we are made of stardust. So that was really the idea that drove the visuals and the creation of a human connection to the cosmos.
So, Yasmin, you just hit on something a second ago when you were talking about the hybrid nature of your team at Scatter, and you often hear that the phrase when talking about VR teams about the collision of art and science and art and technology. And I think, Eliza, you've, I think, used the term that science, you talk about science as a storytelling medium. Forgive me if I'm mangling your quote, but I'm curious, one of the things that I find particularly exciting about the growing community of developers in this medium is the literal diversity of the skill sets and the people in the mix. Can you talk a little more about that? Because it does feel like an opportunity to reset the norms that have existed in creative industries, or have built up and accrued over years in creative industries. Can you talk a little more about your art and technology
Yeah.
hybrid?
Yeah. At Scatter, I think we are pretty, as I had mentioned, we are a bunch of technologists and artists and filmmakers, and a lot of the tools that have come out of some of my partners, James George and Alexander Porter, to create the first VR documentary that captured people volumetrically. They created a tool which is called DepthKit, and so I think part of this idea of leveling the playing field is having the ability to build the tools to express yourselves that don't exist is kind of where I think what's exciting for us, at least as a team, and I think this is kind of where it can really play the level the playing field. And a big kind of mission from a Scatter perspective and a DepthKit perspective is the idea of accessibility. And so these are tools that are actually available to anyone. That if you want to download it, it's in a private beta, and anyone can sign up. And it uses off-the-shelf DepthKit sensors, and it's a software tool, so anyone can use it with any type of hardware they want. And the idea is to not only from a perspective of creators, that whether you're an artist or a technologist, but also having a diversity of voices across the board, representing people in VR, but also people creating and doing the volumetric filmmaking work itself. We also want to make sure it's accessible, and it's a diverse group of people approaching it. And that's the only way I think you're going to get this really exciting and rich array of stories and perspectives in the field.
Yeah, I mean, our whole studio's been founded on that principle as well. If you look at the way our studio's broken up, it's actually kind of overwhelmingly technical. Technical, which is why we try as much as possible to hire people who have both those genes in them. Our CTO is, he was the ex-CTO at What a Digital, but he's also a very creative guy. And we really, we chose them to kind of build a team of similar-minded people, which is also kind of what my background is. I mean, I'd say I lean more on the creative than technical, but I always had that side in me. And I designed the first 360 camera we used and wrote the first app to play that video. And I think, every piece we make needs to be, at this stage, we're so early in the medium that it's way too early to repeat ourselves. So every piece needs to be innovative, both creatively and technologically. And so when we're on the set, whether we're directing or whoever is working on the camera, or as much of the crew as possible is constantly pushing the boundaries. We need to have both those things in our heads at all times, because at any given moment that a challenge comes up, you need to be thinking of either or a creative and technical solution to a problem. And then once you're done shooting, you go back to the studio and you work on upgrading the tools and also on, that's something we now can do, and then making that part of the DNA of whatever new project you're going to be coming up with. So it's been really hard to separate the two, really. It's almost like hard to define, which is really hard with giving people titles, I find. Everyone's doing so many things.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that art and science really inform each other. And I was really fortunate to have an incredible team of animators and worked alongside the Endless Collective and sound designers at Arup, which is actually it is an architecture firm that built the Sydney Opera House, but they also have a sound lab. And alongside also Jess Engel, who's a producer and now the director of original content